more versatile pieces to their secondary. A impressive slot cornerback competition is brewing for the Seahawks heading towards training camp. Who holds the edge? We're going to be diving in with some way too early predictions on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, for our Monday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rain. A special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are getting closer to training camp now, less than 6 weeks away from the start of the festivities at the VMAC. So we'll continue diving into a number of key topics heading towards the start of the 2023 season. We've got a slot competition that could feature as many as 4 or even 5 players battling for that spot. We're going to be breaking that down today. We've got our Monday mailbag. We're going into regular season mode now that the draft and OTAs and all that stuff is passed. So we're going to bring back our annual or weekly Monday mailbag, and we're going to continue our 90-player countdown with numbers 75 through 71. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's been a busy offseason on the defensive side of the football for the Seahawks, including adding a couple more versatile chess pieces to their secondary. They brought in Julian Love as a free agent on a 2-year deal, part insurance policy for Jamal Adams and part accessory that we can put in a number of different spots, play him with Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs. And they use a top 5 pick on Devon Witherspoon, who played a fair amount of snaps inside at Illinois during his All-American season for the Fighting Illini last year. And with those pieces, Rob, Coby Bryant was the slot corner most of last season, but it feels like this is a wide open race at that position. And I'm not necessarily even sure that there's going to be a pure starter at this position. It might be one of those things that it changes week in, week out, depending on who they're playing, because of the number of talented players they have in the secondary. They can truly mix and match against certain opponents.
Yeah, to complement your point, Corbin, I think you could mention Trey Brown, obviously a former second-round pick, or former early-round pick, that the Seahawks drafted out of Oklahoma. A playmaker in his own right, who always has the size that I think translates best inside that nickel cornerback spot. I do think that if it comes down to trying to make a prediction as to who we think is going to start, me, I'm always going to kind of go with the incumbent. I was very encouraged by what the Seahawks saw from Coby Bryant a year ago. And at the same time, I also love the fact that Devon Witherspoon is already lining up some snaps in nickel position as well. So I think that the Seahawks are, as you suggested, I think that they are going to be willing to try to play matchups a little bit and kind of see what they have. It slowly get Devon Witherspoon onto the field. You don't want to, push him onto the field, when you already have a quality player and Mike Jackson on the outside. But obviously, if you're going to use the number 5 overall selection, you want to get Witherspoon on the field. And as we've talked about before, I personally think that Witherspoon is a terrific fit there, because it's not just about having the smaller, quicker nickel corners in there. Again, you're closer to the line of scrimmage, as we talked about. And Witherspoon, one of the best things about him is his physicality, is his instincts. So I do think that he could be very successful in that role. I still think the most likely candidate at this point is going to be Coby Bryant. But again, when you have a player that has the versatility, as you mentioned, with Julian Love, again, I'm still very, very high on Trey Brown, who of course was a 4th-round pick, not a 2nd-round pick, as I mentioned before. But still, you have a lot of really good football players at that spot. So, Corbin, I think that the nickel or slot corner spot is going to be one of those matchups, one of those positional battles I really think is going to be one of the more fascinating ones here that not a lot of people are talking about. Everybody's going to be talking about center. Everybody's going to be talking about, the nickel or slot receiver position. I think this is one that is going to be critical if the Seahawks are going to be able to take that jump up and really be a playoff real contender, not just somebody fighting for the last wild card position.
Yeah, a lot of the competitions we've talked about at this point, we looked at who's going to be the other starter across from Uchenna Nwosu, rushing the passer. We've looked at the center position. We've looked at right guard. A lot of those are very cut and dry. I don't feel like that's the case at slot corner because it seems like this is a multifaceted position, especially playing a Vic Fangio style scheme. And you have a guy like Julian Love who has a lot of snaps in the slot in the NFL for the Giants. He's more of that big bodied slot, but he has the quickness to be able to handle those smaller, quicker receivers. And so maybe when Jamal Adams is healthy, we don't know if that's week 1 or a few weeks into the season. We don't know how that's going to play out. But when Jamal Adams is healthy, I actually think that Julian Love is going to play more snaps than anybody as that nickel defender. They're just going to be using the position a little differently than they've done in the past. Now, if you have Julian Love playing in place of Jamal Adams, then Coby Bryant, to me, the way he played last year, the way he improved at that position, I would think that he is going to be the one that's going to get those reps. But Witherspoon really is the wild card here. And I know some of our listeners are going to be thinking, why would we use the number 5 overall pick on a slot corner? And just hear me out. I don't think that that's going to be where he's playing most of the time. But I could see a scenario where the Seahawks move him into the nickel in certain situations, and they plug Mike Jackson in across from Tariq Woolen and get all 3 of those guys on the field together, because I think Witherspoon can play that position at a very high level, and then he'll play in the boundary the rest of the time. I feel like there's a lot of mixing and matching that they can do not just week to week, but drive to drive. And they've just got a lot of different pieces with different skill sets. And I think this makes it very intriguing. If we're just looking at a traditional slot cornerback spot, I would think that Coby Bryant has the foot through the door there because of how he played last year. And he's only going to get better because that was the first season he played the position. But it isn't as cut and dry as that because you're going to be playing different types of teams. There are going to be different game situations. Julian Love brings a different skill set. Devon Witherspoon brings a different skill set. Even Trey Brown brings a different skill set. And it's a good problem to have, but I feel like this is going to be one of those spots where there might not necessarily be a starter. There might be a pseudo starters and they just mix and match guys. And it might depend how games play out. And if a guy's struggling, we're going to chuck this guy into the lineup instead and try to switch things up. They've afforded themselves that kind of flexibility. It was interesting seeing what our listeners thought about this position. This ended up being a lot closer than I thought it was going to be. And again, a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Well over 1,000 votes on our polls. Who's going to be the week 1 starter at slot cornerback? And this is what our listeners said, Rob. Coby Bryant winning barely, like by the hair on his head. 40%, 446 votes. Devon Witherspoon, 39%, 434 votes. Julian Love, a distant third at 17%. And Trey Brown hasn't played the slot for the Seahawks. And I think a lot of our listeners felt like that wasn't a position he was even going to get an opportunity at. So he only got 48 votes, 4%. So this really was a 2-horse race, Bryant versus Witherspoon. So it does seem like our listeners are buying into the idea that maybe Witherspoon could play some snaps inside. Maybe that allows Mike Jackson to get some snaps on the outside, or maybe the Seahawks have something else up their sleeves at the outside cornerback position. But they have enough talent, enough starter caliber players where it really does create a lot of intrigue, as you said, Rob.
No, it absolutely does. And, I agree with what our listeners just, posted up there. I really think that it is basically a 2-man race if you are looking for that traditional nickel cornerback spot. But I love the way that you kind of characterized a couple of moments ago, Corbin, that, whether or not Jamal Adams is going to be on the field or not, that's going to play a huge role in determining which role that Julian Love is going to play. And so I do think that they're going to see Julian Love playing a lot of those, that slot receiver or nickel corner kind of role, and I also think that, again, when they are going to be going up against receiver, the more passing friendly offenses, that's when I think you're going to see Seattle transition a little bit more to those, more of a traditional cornerback spot, like a Coby Bryant or, again, a Witherspoon. And one last little comment on that. I hear you when you say that there might be some listeners out there, some fans out there that are going to criticize the Seahawks if Witherspoon is the starter only the starter at that nickel spot, or if he isn't even in Seattle's starting lineup in the very first time they go into that 3 defensive back look as far as the corners, that nickel look. I just think, again, it's a testament to the talent that Seattle has in the secondary. Why among I was among the draft analysts out there who was absolutely stunned when Seattle made the selection that they did. Not that he's not a good football player, just that, again, this was obviously a position of strength for the Seahawks. And so, again, I think almost regardless of who winds up shaking out being the starter, I think that Seattle's secondary talent and depth is going to be a big reason why this club should be in the thick of the playoff race.
When we return, we're going to be tackling your questions. Even though it's not the regular season or even training camp yet, we are going into regular season mode with our mailbag, bringing it back on Mondays. We're going to answer as many of your questions as we can. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel as the NFL season quickly approaches, because right now, new customers can get $1,000 on their first bet, a no-sweat first bet. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from season awards to week one props to exact regular season win totals, even with training camp still over a month away. I'm excited to dig into season props such as NFL MVP, Rookie of the Year, and more. Regardless of what prop you choose, you'll get paid instantly if you win. There's no better place to bet on all the upcoming football action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NFL. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Everydayers, you won't want to miss it. We're bringing back Throwback Tuesday on tomorrow's episode, and we're switching things up a little bit. We like to give out our history lessons, but we're going to be selecting our own all underrated all-time Seahawks teams. And we're going to start with quarterbacks and safeties on tomorrow's show. So some history, going back in time a little bit, and building the ultimate all underrated squads. Should be a lot of fun. We're going to kick that off tomorrow, so you won't want to miss it. Let's get to our mailbag, shall we? And our first question here coming off of Twitter. And Rob, this one's coming from Hawkstrologer tweeting, how is our 3-tech, 3-4 end position looking so far, specifically Miles Adams and Mike Morris? And it's fitting, we didn't necessarily get to see these guys at mandatory minicamp, but we have gotten to see both these players on the field some this spring. And if you're like me, at least in the case of one of these players, there is a lot of intrigue going into this season.
Well, I'm intrigued by both the players. They're just very different players. Miles Adams, is more in that, the 6'2", 6'3", 275, 280 pound kind. He's short, he's quick. He is an inside penetrator. He's got some strength to be able to hold up the point of attack, but he is not just the Tyrannosaurus Rex that is Mike Morris. I mean, he is, 6'6", 285 pounds, 300 pounds, but the broad shoulders, the long arms. I mean, he just kind of blocks out the sun when he walks by. He's kind of that traditional 3-4 defensive end. So there you got, again, just very different body types. I think that they can be on the field at the same time. I don't think that they're necessarily going to be playing the same situations, playing the same role very often. I do think that they are two of the very intriguing young defensive linemen that Seattle is looking to build around.
And you just watch Morris on the field. And again, eye test only means so much until we get to when the pads come out in August. But that is a guy, literally the first day of rookie minicamp. I knew he's a big dude, but then we get on the field, it's like, who is this guy just towering over everybody? And so you've got his skill set. And then you got a player like Miles Adams, who last year, watched him in the Jets game obliterate a double team as a nose tackle. So even though he's a smaller guy, he plays with good technique and leverage. And so he's made big improvements since he first came into Seattle. So both these guys are going to be in the mix for a lot of snaps on that defensive line. Our next question here coming from Kiki NFL Cuba tweets, how can Shane Waldron approach and involve the tight end core more? That is a good question, because I felt like at times last year, early in the season, the tight ends were a bigger focal point. And then it felt like when the Seahawks really struggled in the second half of the season, they lost 5 out of 6 games at one point. The run game wasn't there. But the other thing that stood out to me, and we talked about this a lot during the season, Rob, it felt like there was less emphasis on scheming the tight ends into the passing game. And they got back to that late in the season when they started to regain that momentum and then got into the playoffs. And so as far as getting them more involved, I'd like them to take a page out of what they did early last season, where they're finding ways to utilize players. Like Will Dissly is one of those guys that you can do a lot of fun stuff with, where he's having delayed routes, where he starts blocking and then goes out into the field running seams or running wheel routes. He's not a burner, but he's still a guy, if he looks like he's blocking, that you can forget about. And we know that he's made people pay for that. And Colby Parkinson, for goodness sakes, get him targets in the red zone. That doesn't just fall on Shane Waldron. That falls on Geno Smith, too. You got a 6'7" athletic tight end that has really soft hands. That should be a spot where he is getting a lot of touches, a lot of opportunities. And I know it's tough with all the talent they've got, but those would be the two big things for me. Find ways schematically to make them more involved, particularly guys like Will Dissly, where you do need to scheme things up a little bit. And in the red zone, all of your tight ends have the ability to be effective there. It just felt like last season, especially the second half, that they got away from that. Some of that's on Geno and some of that's on Shane Waldron, but I'd like to see more incorporation of those tight ends inside the 20s, because that's really where those guys should be major weapons, most notably Colby Parkinson. Our next question here for Rob. This one's coming from King JB. Tweets, does Seattle make the defensive scheme around Jamal Adams again, or do they go another direction? I think this is a really good question because, in part, again, we don't know if Jamal Adams is going to be ready for the start of the season, which can impact the way that they set this defense up going into the year.
Yeah, I think that it's a really important question, and I love that it's kind of simply put. And we kind of danced around this topic, so many times in so many different ways. I do think that the Seahawks are trying to build around a player like Jamal Adams. I think that because he is unique as he is, and there's just not a lot of guys that have his explosiveness, his instincts as a pass rusher at his frame, then it's difficult to replace him. But I think that some of the players that Seattle's brought in, we talked about Julian Love, and there's a couple of these undrafted free agents here that we're going to be talking about in just a couple of moments that, again, I think are kind of designed in Seattle's scheme to kind of play a similar role. So I do think that Seattle wants to incorporate a more aggressive blitzing box safety hybrid, whatever you want to call them. I think that they want to be able to do that and create a little bit more surprise to the opponents, rather than just having the traditional edge rushers on the outside.
Yeah, they got to find ways to get him blitzing the quarterback from spots other than just off the edge, because that was the problem they ran into in 2021. And then last year, they blitzed him up the A gap. He gets right to Russell Wilson. Unfortunately, that was the play he got hurt on. But it does seem like they had a better plan, and I think they're going to try to stick with that. And they've done some things personnel-wise that should help if Adams isn't ready for week 1. Jason on YouTube, how concerned should Seattle be about Alton Robinson's injury? And if he's not healthy at the start of the season, who benefits the most? I'm going to be honest. I don't know that Seattle is overly concerned about this situation, because right now he would be the 6th edge rusher on my depth chart. I think that Tyreek Smith is viewed in a higher light in the organization based on what I've been told. I think they're really excited to see what he can do coming back from his own injury. And that's not to say that Robinson couldn't be a factor. We've seen some good things from him when he's been healthy, but this just seems like there's been a lot of ominous reporting on this, including from Pete Carroll himself. It just doesn't seem like Alton Robinson's been able to make progress coming back from this injury. It's really been a slow haul, and he sounds like he's a long way away from coming back. He and Brian Monet both being lumped in there. So Tyreek Smith obviously is one of the big beneficiaries, but Josh Oniogo, who played in one game last year for the Seahawks, coming out of Framingham State, a Division III school, I think he's the one that benefits the most from this, because they liked what they saw last year, and he arguably has a quicker first step off the edge than what Alton Robinson does. So he might actually be a better fit for this 3-4 if you can develop a few more counters to go with the underrated bend that he's got around the edge. So Oniogo would be the one that I think really stands to gain here, because he made the initial 53 last year. If Alton Robinson is on the PUP list, can't play, then he's got a chance to be one of those edge guys that sneaks onto the roster. Yeah, I'll let Rob weigh in on this too.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in on that one just real quick. I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to who is most likely to benefit, Oniogo, I think just because of the potential roster spot, and I think that he is very much on the outside looking in if Seattle has all of their young drafted edge rushers available to them. I would say this as far as playing time, because Alton Robinson, when he was healthy a couple of years ago, did get some fairly significant playing time. I think it's definitely got to be Derek Hall. I think that is a huge reason why that Seattle has focused in on the players that are known as team captains, do have these kind of stories of inspiration. I think the Seahawks very much want to get Derek Hall onto the field. I think that they are really intrigued by Hall and Boye Mafe in particular. Those two edge rushers, I think those guys would very much be benefiting from any type of extended absence from an Alton Robinson, from a Tyreek Smith, from anybody else, should they go down or not come in the perfect shape the way that Darrell Taylor did a year ago.
And last question for Rob here, coming from Mark W. Who is your all-pro dark horse to watch on this Seahawks team? So maybe not a known commodity star, but a guy that maybe is off the radar that you could see having a monster season that somehow makes the all-pro team.
Well, considering that I thought he should have got Offensive Rookie of the Year a year ago, I'm not going to suggest that Ken Walker III is just some diamond in the rough candidate. But I think that when you look at the landscape in the NFC at the running back position, then it's shifting. And I do think that there is a potential for somebody to be able to kind of catapult themselves into that realm, and I think that Ken Walker III can do that. I think that when it's all said and done, it's not as likely to happen, because I think that you're going to see a Zach Charbonnet or somebody like that steal away those touchdowns that usually put you in that kind of realm. But I think that there's a chance that Ken Walker III is absolutely among the most productive edge or the most productive rushers in all of the NFL this season. And again, other than a DK Metcalf or somebody like that, or a Geno Smith, I think that there's going to be a lot of NFL fans out there that would be surprised if another one of Seattle's running back wound up being a Pro Bowl caliber player.
One last question here, and this one's coming from Gary on YouTube. If Aaron Donald became available via trade, would you be willing to cut Jamal Adams and another player to make it happen? So if we're going to live in this fantasy world and Aaron Donald does become available to acquire, then yes, I would strongly consider this, because I think a player like that, even with him being 32, he is still an elite player, arguably the best defensive lineman that's ever played the game. And I know he was banged up some last year, but yes, I would strongly consider at that point, especially with Adams' health issues that he's been dealing with. With that being said, I want to put out the smoke or the fire, whatever's going around out there, because let's face it, this came from a discussion that was on Seattle Sports 710 last week. And I don't think that Mike Salk and Brock Heward were trying to hint that this was actually something that was going to happen. They were talking about this from a standpoint, is Aaron Donald going to be a player that if they acquired him, would that put them over the top and make them a legitimate Super Bowl contender, which I thought was an intriguing question. But as far as actually trading for him, for one thing, Rob, you and I would both agree on this. The Rams are not going to trade Aaron Donald within the division if they were going to move him. They're not going to trade him to the Seahawks, the 49ers, or even the Cardinals. They would trade him out of the division if he was going to get moved. And the Seahawks have so many financial issues right now they got to deal with. Yeah, releasing Jamal Adams would help. It would open up more than $8 million in cap space, but they'd have to do at least one other move to be able to fit Aaron Donald's contract in, if it was even a plausible possibility, which it is not. And I just want to make sure that I make that clear, that it's fun. If you want to put him on your roster on Madden, go for it. But there's some other players that might be on the move from other teams that maybe Seattle could look at, like a Daniel Hunter. Aaron Donald, though, is not going to be in a Seattle Seahawks uniform. So I hate to break that to you, 12s, but it's not going to happen. Let's shift gears now real quick to our 90-man countdown. And we are now on numbers 75 through 71. And Rob, we're going to start getting into some undrafted players that maybe have a legitimate opportunity to make this football team. We've talked about a few others. We know Chris Stahl right now has literally no competition at all at the long snapper position. But a lot of the undrafted players we talked about face really long odds. There's going to be a few guys on this list that have legitimate opportunities to maybe make this football team. So let's start things off in the secondary. And this is a player, at least from a trait standpoint, size-wise, has some intrigue. And that's Christian Young, coming from Arizona, where he actually was a starter for parts of 5 seasons in the Pac-12.
Yeah, and that's the thing. was moved all over the field for the Wildcats. Corner, linebacker, safety. He's a well-built guy, 6'1", 220 pounds. It looks a little bit more like a linebacker or kind of a rover safety. That's, as I mentioned before, I think that the Seahawks are very much expecting Jamal Adams to be able to make a significant impact this season. And if not Adams specifically, then someone else playing that role. Christian Young is one of the two players that are going to be guys that we're going to be talking about today. He and former Penn State safety Jonathan Sutherland, who I think could play that role. Certainly Julian Love can play that role as well. But I think that these are two of the undrafted free agents that Seattle is looking to kind of groom to see if they might be able to get a diamond in the rough at this particular position.
The biggest concerns that I have with Young, he's not a great athlete. When you look at the testing numbers, he did not test well across the board. And I believe he only had one interception his entire college career. This is not a guy that is known for his ball skills, but he'll come up and hit you. There's occasionally lapses as a tackler, but he racked up some good numbers as a tackler. He can create fumbles. He's a guy that can blitz a little bit, and he's got really good size. So he does fit that box safety role. Now, let's go to the offensive line here at number 74. And this is a last name that's going to be familiar because Reggie McKenzie, who used to be the general manager of the Raiders, this is his second son that has now played for the Seahawks. His older brother, Khalil, was on Seattle's practice squad for a little while. And now Jalen McKenzie's coming back for his second stint with Seattle. He was on the practice squad last year. And this guy's interesting, Rob, because you look at the college stats at USC, he started a lot of games over a 4-year span, but he was never necessarily, until his senior year, was never really a full-time starter. But he didn't give up a sack in his final year at USC. He did have some penalty issues, but this is a player that it still feels like there's some untapped potential. And if there was going to be a year where he was going to fight to make the roster, with Gabe Jackson now being released and them having Phil Haynes and Anthony Bradford as really the only other guards with Damian Lewis, if he's able to come in and make major strides technique-wise, especially in the run game, he got pushed around a little bit last year. But if he is a guy that can come in and show that he has gotten stronger and that translates to the run game, maybe he ends up being one of those players that's on the peripheral that maybe has a chance to make this football team. I still think it's going to be difficult with Bradford being there and Haynes as well as Lewis. And you've also got Evan Brown that can play guard as well. That's going to make it tougher. But at the same time, compared to last year, the fact they did bring him back, it suggests that the organization views him in a strong light. So they might give him a legitimate opportunity to make this football team. And now let's go back to the skill positions. And we got to make sure we say this guy's name right because we've been saying it wrong and a lot of announcers have been saying it wrong. But Griffin Hebert from Louisiana Tech, he played receiver and then they moved him to tight end last year. He's now 239 pounds. This is the polar opposite of Christian Young, who didn't have a good pro day. Hebert had a dominant pro day workout for a hybrid tight end, potential fullback candidate. And I know that you and I have been really excited to see what he might be able to bring to the table when we get to training camp.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by Hebert. This is a guy, again, he was a former wide receiver, kind of got bigger and stronger, played a little bit of a more of a tight end role. I think that he'd be like kind of that H-back role for Seattle, as we talked about, kind of had some Kyle Juszczyk shades to his game. I just love the hands, the body control. He had a catch, in the back of the end zone against Southern Miss a couple of years ago that really just showed how quickly he could leap, how coordinated he was to be able to kind of contort in space. Corbin, he is one of the best I've ever seen at his size, that as far as tracking the ball over his shoulder, over his right shoulder, over his left shoulder, completely over the top of his head. It's just, he's a very natural receiver in that regard, or in that way. And so that's why I'm really kind of intrigued by him. There was the question previously during our, Q&A session and about how Seattle is going to use the tight ends. I'm not so sure that Seattle is going to use their tight ends as uniquely as they did a year ago, because I think that's just going to be the role that Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to play. But I do think that there could be a role that you could use a player like Bear, and more in the flats and things like that. The way that we saw that the Seahawks have used some of their other smaller, tight end H-back kind of players in the past. So again, a really intriguing player with Bear, and a guy that, as you mentioned, had a spectacular workout. I mean, when he was signed by Louisiana Tech, this was a really slim frame guy. He has bulked himself up, and yet still ran the 4.5, still almost had the 40-yard dash. And again, the ball skills were very much on display during his pro day positional workout, as well as the time drills.
The big thing that he's going to have to work on is the blocking, because you can just tell watching him last year when he moved to tight end that he was still blocking like a receiver. And that's not being offensive, because there's some really good blocking receivers. The Seahawks have had them over the years. Guys like Doug Baldwin and DK Metcalf. And Tyler Lockett, I think, is a very underrated blocker. And there's a mentality to it. But just the way that he uses his hands and the technique, you can just tell it's not something that he has done very much. And so he is going to have to develop in that area, whether you're using him as a tight end or you're using him as an H-back to play some of that fullback role. That's where I'm most intrigued by him. Like you said, in the flats, that's a guy you dump it off to that can do some real damage with the football in his hands. And maybe you can develop him to move tight end in a couple of years that can play significant snaps. I just don't ever see him being an inline guy. That's just not going to be his game with the blocking issues that he has. But as far as receiving and moving him around, there's a lot of fun stuff that you can do with him. We know the Seahawks love big, long arm corners, and they've gone away from that a little bit the last few years. We saw with Trey Brown being 5'9", 5'10", and having sub 32-inch arms. Devon Witherspoon is not a huge guy, 180-something pounds. So they have changed things up a little bit, but that does not mean that Pete Carroll, when he sees a 6'3" corner over 200 pounds with long arms, that he's not going to at least be intrigued and want to take a look. And that's why Lance Boykin, to me, is one of the players in this really deep cornerback group that I don't know that he necessarily has a chance to make this team because of all the talent we've talked about, but I am very fascinated to see him on the field playing in this defense, because we're talking about a guy that was kind of a late bloomer. He started Old Dominion. He transferred eventually to Coastal Carolina, and last year had 2 interceptions, 6 pass breakups, had a sack. He's a guy that you can move around a little bit. He can blitz. He'll hit people. And so I look at Boykin, a corner who's 6'2", almost 200 pounds, got long arms. This is one of those prototypical boundary corners that was a really good special teams player, both for Old Dominion and Coastal Carolina. And so if he can come in and make some tackles on your kick and punt coverage units, and he's able to show some things on the outside and the limited opportunities he gets on defense. Again, I don't think he's making this roster, but this could be a player down the road you develop on the practice squad. He has a lot of the traits that the Seahawks look for at outside cornerback and the instincts to go with it as well. And so I think Boykin is certainly a player to watch. As far as players to watch, I think you and I both want to weigh in on our last guy on today's countdown. You've already name dropped him a couple times in this episode because he's been getting some first team reps with Jamal Adams being out this offseason, and that's Jonathan Sutherland coming from Penn State. And I'm not going to lie, Rob, I've watched a little bit of Penn State the last couple of years, being a Big Ten guy, Midwest guy. This player did not have gaudy stats, but every time I watched Penn State, I saw this guy flying all over the field, spent some time in the box, kind of that money linebacker role. And he reminded me of Ryan Neal, to be honest with you. Not as tall, but the way he played reminded me of Ryan Neal. And I just think it's kind of fitting that he is now coming to Seattle after Ryan Neal leaves to go to Tampa Bay. And maybe he's a guy that can fill that role as a dynamic reserve safety that has talent to start if you need him to.
Yeah, he's got those, the long hair in the back, And
he kind of looks like him. He
does. He looks and plays a little bit like Ryan Neal. He is kind of just all over the place in that he just has some instincts. He's not an elite athlete, but he's not bad. He's not the biggest guy, but he's not bad. And, it's like he does everything pretty well. And he happened to be surrounded by some guys who were just legitimate NFL draft picks at the safety position throughout his career. I mean, this is a guy who was a 4-year team captain and started 3 games. I mean, that's crazy. That's the kind of mentality that he practiced with. You mentioned the special teams and the versatility. Again, just because you don't start doesn't mean you don't play, and he is a testament to that. And so I just think, to me, he's one of those glue guys, and so I'm really curious to see how well that he how well he does in Seattle, because it felt like he was surrounded by so much talent at Penn State that he was consistently overlooked, and I think that's why he was available to the Seahawks. And so now he's going to get this opportunity where, again, he is coming to a secondary I just mentioned before. I think is really the strength of this defense, and he might be able to do the exact same thing. Just like I was excited about Coby Bryant a year ago. I mean, obviously, Sauce Gardner got all the love. It was Coby Bryant that wound up walking away with the Thorpe Award. Same kind of thing here. I think that this guy's got a shot. I like the physicality. We mentioned Christian Young, the kid from Arizona, a moment ago, and I think that they might be playing that same type of role. I just see a different urgency with this young man. I mean, every tackle he makes, it is physical. He's quick to the ball. Yep. There's something about this guy. So I'm really intrigued by Jonathan. I want to see what he is able to do when they really start hitting, because as you mentioned, you can't really wrap up in these type of OTAs and things. So while he's getting those starting reps, maybe it is just a bodies thing. Maybe it is that he has really impressed the Seahawks coaching staff to this point, and they do view him as having a real opportunity for significant playing time.
As you mentioned, he was a 4-time captain at Penn State. There's only been one other player in Penn State's entire program history that has done that. And we're talking about Penn State's had a lot of really good football players come out of there. Yeah. They've had a lot of captains, really good captains come out of there. For him to have that reputation, to be selected by teammates for 4 seasons as a captain, that's a big deal. We know how much the Seahawks value that stuff, but he also had a game that he blocked not 1, but 2 punts in the same game. So he can do some really fun stuff on special teams. Ryan Neal had a block punt at one point for the Seahawks. Again, I see a lot of parallels, not the exact same body type, but the way that they play the game. And Ryan Neal got benched at Southern Illinois at FCS school at one point in his career. So if you want to say, well, a guy like this can't make an NFL roster and be a better NFL player than college, well, Jonathan Sutherland, again, as you mentioned, he had a lot of really good players around him in that secondary. That means that he might be one of those guys that is a better player in the NFL than college when he's given a better opportunity. And this is a defense where I think his skill sets, playing that money box linebacker safety role and starring on special teams, could work for him. Like any player at that position, again, there's a lot of talent in front of him. If Jamal Adams is healthy, it's going to make it really tricky for any of these undrafted guys to make it. But the fact that he's getting the praise he's gotten so far, he's been getting first-team reps, teammates are raving about it. This isn't just Pete Carroll. There have been veterans talking about this kid. That means something even this time of year. So I think that he is certainly one of the undrafted guys to keep a very close eye on under the microscope as we get closer to training camp. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We're bringing back Throwback Tuesday tomorrow as we start putting together our all underrated teams. It should be a blast. Make sure that you are listening in for a bit of a history lesson as well. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.